Hello, my love. This is chapter 2, Tuesday. Okay. My grandma always says Tuesday. She gets to really choose in there. Tuesday? Whatever. Miyuki started the first full day of her stay as she always did. She woke up a bit later than she would have done at home and spent a while rubbing her eyes and staring at the ceiling. When she felt she had done enough of that, she wriggled out of her makeshift pajamas and put on several layers of clothes while still under the duvet. She got to her feet and shuffled through to the miniature kitchen in the corner of the sitting room, where she put 3 thick slices of white bread under the grill and fried half a bag of onion rings in the margarine. She laced the food with ketchup and brown sauce and ate it fast, washing it down with a cup of strong black tea. After brushing her teeth and sluicing the sleep out of her eyes, she filled up her water bottle, strapped on her boots, stepped outside, and walked out of the village along the coast path. There was a light morning haze, but not enough to mask the blue of the sky. After a while, she left the main trail to follow a faint track of flattened grass that had been left by the feet of various animals and the boots of other walkers. They had led to the end of a promontory, where she stood a couple of steps back from a sheer drop. A breeze was blowing in from the sea, and she faced it without blinking as tears ran sideways to her earlobes. Taking deep breaths, she closed her eyes and listened for a long time to the waves as they pummeled the cliff. When she opened them again, the haze was almost gone, and the day was turning out just the way she had spent 11.5 months hoping it would. Back on the main path, she met a small and amiable gang of wild ponies, and was glad that she had remembered to put a carrot in her pocket. She snapped it into chunks and made sure each of them got a piece before she carried on along the cliff tops. She walked for miles without seeing another soul, and it felt as if the coastline belonged to her alone. In the summer, the place would be crawling with surfers, climbers, and sunbathers, the narrow roads jammed with cars, and the paths submerged beneath lines of walkers. She was glad she was able to go there in the middle of winter. Feeling a thirst coming on, she checked her map and walked inland to a pub in a small village. She got there to find she was their first customer of the day. They hadn't lit the fire, and the air carried a faint smell of toilet cleaner. As with most of the pubs in the area, she had been in a few times before. She exchanged a smile of recognition with the woman behind the bar and abandoned the vague rule she had about never drinking before noon. Ordered a pint of OSB. When it appeared on the bar, the glass was full to the brim. Her hands were small, and she had to use both of them to get a steady grip and bring it to her lips without spilling any. As she slowly lifted it up and dipped her head to meet it, she was reminded, as often was in this situation, of footage she had seen of a Japanese tea ceremony. The movement came so naturally to her that she couldn't help feeling as though the muscles it used must have contained the ghost of an ancient memory. She pictured herself in a kimono, then felt a familiar sharp stab of embarrassment because all she was doing was drinking the top of a pint of beer, and that had nothing to do with being half Japanese. Once she had swallowed the first mouthful and there was a clear half-inch at the top, she was able to use one hand to lift the glass without the risk of spilling anything. She went outside and sat at the picnic table where she read the first chapter of that day's book, and had some difficulty eating a bag of dirty, dry roasted peanuts with gloves on. After her second pint, she left the pub and walked back to the coast path and towards the cottage. She found herself wondering whether anything dramatic would happen over the coming fortnight. Maybe she would find a barrel of whiskey that had washed ashore, or an abandoned baby by the roadside. She gave these scenarios some thought before deciding that if it came to it, she would raise the child and drink the whiskey, but she hoped she wouldn't have to. She didn't come here in search of adventure. Her boots had picked up quite a lot of mud, so she left them on the front step. Once she was inside, she got the fire going and boiled the kettle for some instant rice, which she ate from the plastic pot. She left the stove's door open and read some more of her book as the flames warmed her feet. Just before it started getting dark, she put her boots and coat on and walked back out to the coast path in the direction of one of her favorite sites. A short way from the village, she walked across the grass to the edge of the cliff. Below her lay a small cove. There were plenty of small coves along the stretch of the coast, and a lot of them were surrounded by cliffs so steep that they couldn't be reached from the land. Miyuki would stand as close as she dared to the edge, peering down at the rocks and sand below, and wishing she could float down and explore. This cove was different, though. The cliff around it was still quite steep, but it wasn't particularly high. It was just about navigable. A narrow path had been defined by adventurous visitors, and it was possible with some care to get down to the sea level. She didn't do that, though. At least not yet. Instead, she stood where she was, taking deep breaths of the evening breeze and waiting. The air smelled and tasted differently from earlier, more seaweedy. Seaweedy. She supposed that had something to do with the tides. The sky was clear, pale blue, and the waves were low. Just as the sun was a thumb's width from the horizon, she felt a shiver as she saw what she had come to see. She had stumbled upon this sight on her first visit to the village and had found herself returning to it year after year. Whenever the sky was clear at the end of the day, one of the rocks in the cove below looked for just a few minutes as if it had turned to gold. She stood memorized for a while, but it wasn't long before she snapped into life and made her way down the steep, narrow path to see it up close. The top of the beach was made up of boulders, and she had to watch her feet as she crossed it. The lower part was a mixture of sand and pebbles, with rocks poking out of it here and there. Gray rocks of all shapes and sizes in one big block of gold. Miyuki had always reluctantly accepted that the rock only appeared to be gold from the cliff top because of a coincidence of light and angles and other things she didn't really understand. But part of her still hoped that one day she would climb down to find it looking just as golden as it had from above. It was an almost perfect square about 5 feet across, and even though it lay above the seaweed and driftwood of the tide line, it seemed to have been smoothed by the waves. The setting sun still reflected brightly from it, but close to it was unmistakably gray, just like all the others. If anybody had been standing on the beach beside her, they wouldn't have singled it out as being at all special or even different. As the reflected sunlight shone in her eyes, the unmistakable sensation of an emerging sneeze consumed her head from the nose inward. There was no need for her to stifle it, and when it came, it was powerful and satisfying. It was swiftly followed by a more pedestrian explosion that brought her a total for the trip to 3. She reached into her pocket for a tissue and blew her nose, then stepped up on the rock and sat cross-legged at the sea as the sea swallowed up the tip of the sun. The dusk was long and slow, and there was still enough light for her to see her way to the top of the cliff and back to the cottage. The evening meal she made for herself was so rudimentary that she felt slightly ashamed eating it. When she was finished, she dumped the plate in the pan in the washing up bowl, put on her coat, and went to the anchor, where she sat in her usual place underneath the stuffed pike. She was fond of the pike. There was a small metal plaque on the wooden frame of its glass case, saying that it had weighed 28 pounds and 8 ounces on the day it had been dragged out of Lingors Lake by a previous landlord of the pub. Her first moment of empathy with it had come when she noticed that the date on the plaque was the same month and year as her own birth. There was no precise day recording, so she couldn't tell if the fish was Aquarius or Pisces, but either way it was close enough for it to count as a contemporary. Moments later, she felt stupid as it struck her that a pike of that size must have been swimming around for years, and rather than marking its birthday, the plaque recorded the time of its death. By that point, though, a bond had been forged. To get around this difficulty, Miyuki counted the start of its new life as a pub ornament, as a birthday. She felt that this still gave them some kind of affinity. Sometimes, as she returned to her table with a fresh pint, she exchanged what she was sure were knowing glances with the dead fish's glassy eye. A couple of years earlier, as 30 loomed for both of them, she had felt as though the fish on the wall knew exactly what she was going through, and that it too must have been asking itself questions about where it was heading, and wondering whether it was time for a new coat of varnish and a change of its slightly shabby diorama. Over at the bar, it was short, Mr. Hughes's round, 3 of the usual, he said to Septic Barry's girlfriend, who was working that night. She pulled him 3 pints of brains. Nothing had been said, but there was a palpable sense of surprise that she had lasted this far into January and was showing no sign of moving on. Usually by this time of year, Septic Barry's girlfriend had gone back to where they had come from, or if they hadn't, they would be looking sheepish as they plotted their imminent departure. This year, though, his girl was still around, and she seemed to be making herself more and more comfortable every day. Location change. Whatever. When he was 16, Septic Barry had argued with his parents over a jar of lemon curd. They had accused him of helping himself to spoonfuls of it, a charge he vigorously denied, his rage turning him alternately brilliant, white and vivid purple. He had, of course, helped himself to the lemon curd, but that didn't stop him from being outraged by the accusation. He poured the contents of his saving jar into a sock, packed his rucksack, left the house, and pitched his tent in a campsite a mile outside the village. He remained incandescent with fury as he lay in his sleeping bag and stared at the fluttering canvas walls of his new home. He worked out that for as long as he held on to this paper round, he would be able to get by. And he pictured himself as an old man, still living in the tent, and getting on his bicycle every morning to deliver papers. The lemon curd incident soon blew over, and Septic Barry, or just Barry as he was then, often went back to his former home for meals that consisted of more than just cheap baked beans eaten straight from the tin. But he didn't see any reason why he should move back in. Not now he had struck out on his own. As he was busy failing his O-levels, the campsite started filling up. Families arrived, and old people and cyclists, walkers, birdwatchers, and foreigners, but most of the people who had shared his field were invisible to Barry. He only had eyes for one kind of visitor. He only had eyes for girls. It hadn't taken him long to master the art of romance. He would see a girl he liked the look of, then stroll over and chat to her about whatever he thought she might be interested in chatting about before casually inviting her to drink some tepid snakebite or sweet white wine with him. Sitting beside her on a beach, a tree stump, or a farm gate, he would impress her with tales of unconventional lifestyle and slowly inch closer as he recited streams of jokes he had memorized from the back pages of Daily Star. If she seemed comfortable to have him so near that she could feel his breath on her face, he would lean into her. And if she leaned back into him, he would put one arm around her and then the other, and he would kiss her. And because she was on holiday, she would kiss him back, in spite of his hair, and they would become a writhing, slurping rod. And what the fuck does that mean? It wasn't long before Barry's old sock was empty, his paper round wasn't making him enough money to pay for a spot in the campsite, and for all the baked beans, snakebite, and sweet white wine, and he realized he was going to have to get a better paid job if he was to maintain his high standard as a bon vivant. Okay, whatever. One afternoon, he fell into conversation with the man who came to sort out the removal of the site's human waste. While they stood watching the thick black pipe quiver as the sludgy excreta of hundreds of holidaymakers shot up into a tanker. What the fuck is happening? Barry happened to mention that he was on the lookout for odds and ends of work, and so it was that at the age of 16 and a half, he handed in his notice to the newsagent and moved into a whole new industry. His new name followed later that same day. When the summer ended and the campsite closed to the public, the owner grudgingly let him move into one of the static caravans for the same money he had been paying to pitch the tent. He spent his summer thinking about the girls he had met, memorizing even more jokes from the back pages of the Daily Star, drifting deeper and deeper into human waste. Ew. After a few years, he had learned more or less all he would ever need to know about the installation and maintenance of septic tanks. And when his boss retired, Septic Barry took over the business. He got himself a bank loan to buy all the equipment and had the tanker and the van repainted. Septic Barry, they said on the side, in big blue letters. A great success since 1994. That's how it's read. But as the years went by and he stayed in business, people quietly admired him. Even though he worked 5.5 days a week, he still found time for the finer things in life. And whenever the site reopened in the spring, he could be found slobbering all over those finer things, sliding his hand under their tops, and all over their soft and wonderful bodies. They stayed for days, sometimes a week, and in their rare cases, even a fortnight. And when each girl was gone, the moment her bus had rounded the bend, he started looking for the next one to talk to drink with, and if the moment arose, to lean into. This went on right up until the terrible day the close sign went up for the winter, and he found himself all alone again. At the end of one season, Septic Barry decided to get in touch with some of his favorite girls from the summer to see if any of them would be interested in spending the cold months with him. Sitting at the fold-away table in the caravan, he rummaged through a pile of torn-up cigarette packets with the names and addresses scrawled on them in lip liner. He tried to remember which detail belonged to which girl. Once he had a reasonable idea of who it was he was writing to, he would send a short, "How are you?" note. Most of them didn't reply, but a few remembered their time with him fondly, and letters began to arrive. The first was from a girl who had decided that she wasn't cut out for college and was wondering what to do with her life. The next was from one who had lost her job and was tired of being nagged by her mother to go out and find another one. And the one after that was from a girl who was just tired of her boyfriend and wanting a change. Before long, he had quite a pile, and when he had decided which of his respondents he liked the best, he invited her to live with him in his caravan. She declined, but undeterred, he moved on to the next one, who also declined. The next one, though, agreed to give it a try, and a couple of weeks later, he drove the tanker down to the bus stop to await her arrival. Year after year, he kept to this strategy, and he found that he could always rely on one of the girls to accept his invitation. Even now, when it was getting harder and harder for him to get away with describing himself a mid-30s, he would make his annual trip to the bus stop and find himself carrying an overstuffed hold all to the tanker for the short journey back to his caravan. Invariably, short of money, his visitors would end up taking on shifts at the pub. One year, the girl who came to stay was the most extraordinarily beautiful creature who had ever been seen in the village. She was incredible. So many people, on walking into the pub and seeing her for the first time, would involuntarily exclaim, "Jesus Christ!" that she just assumed this was a customary local greeting. Without thinking, she started to use it herself. "Jesus Christ," she would cheerfully say as people came in from the cold. "What can I get you?" Mr. Pugh was among the first to encounter her. Before he had a chance to stop himself, he said, "Jesus Christ." "Jesus Christ," replied the girl. "What'll it be?" But the vision had thrown him into such a state of confusion that he completely forgot what his usual drink was. Knowing he had to say something in his eyes being on a bottle of vermouth, anywhere being preferable to the glowing face and compact body before him, he panicked and ordered a sweet martini and pineapple. When asked if he wanted ice and a slice, he just nodded. Septic Barry's girlfriend even added a cherry and a parasol. "There you go," she said, as she gently placed it on the bar. He knew he was supposed to thank her for the drink, but he couldn't move his mouth, and wasn't able to say a word as he handed over his 5-pound note and took his change. Shortly after, short Mr. Hughes arrived. Like Mr. Pugh, he wasn't at all inclined toward blasphemy, but he took one look at the new barmaid and sputtered, "Jesus Christ." "Jesus Christ, what are you having?" He found himself ordering a spritzer with a dash of lime and a chunk of cucumber. And when a similarly disordered tall Mr. Hughes arrived, he took his Savior's name in vain before choosing a peach schnapps and grapefruit with a sprig of mint. They stood in virtual silence, trying as hard as they can to carry on as if nothing was amiss. Unable to say much besides "same again," they stayed on their original drinks all night. Occasionally one of them would half-heartedly mutter something about how a change is as good as a rest, the cliched thudding awkward around the quiet bar. When Mr. Edwards came down to see his new barmaid was getting on, he spotted them with their colorful drink, shook his head and said, "Holy mackerel." The next evening, knowing to brace themselves for the onslaught of golden hair, dazzling teeth, and sparkling blue eyes, they moved back on their usual pints of brains, recovered their manners, and never spoke of their transgressions again. Her presence was inescapable, though. Her nights off should have been an oasis, but she couldn't be trusted not to come in and sit with Septic Barry. So at any moment the door might open, and she could walk in smiling and saying things like "hello" or "how are you?" On both sides of the pub, the regular customers didn't think it was quite right to be in the presence of somebody like her without smelling good, so they rummaged in the backs of bathroom cabinets for long-abandoned bottles of Old Spice, and brought in blue Stratus, unwelcome gifts that had at last found their place in the world. Even Septic Barry had been shocked when he met her at the bus stop. "I remember her being nice enough," he confided to the dazed-looking children from previous relationships. "What the fuck is children from—" okay, whatever. As they watched her at work behind the bar, "but I don't remember her being like that." She hadn't even been close to the top of his list for winter invitations, and he had made his way through quite a pile of torn-up cigarette packets before reaching her address and thinking he might as well give her a try. He had remembered a pleasant, shy girl who had been holidaying with a small group of friends as they waited for their A-level results. Her voice had been gentle, her body slim, and her lips soft, but that could have been said of any number of girls he had met that summer. Something had happened to her since her holiday. She only ever wore simple clothes, usually just jeans and a pullover, and a little light makeup, but she was luminous. As hard as people tried, they couldn't stop themselves from imagining her at it with Septic Berry. What the fuck? She kept appearing in their mind's eye, arching... This is crazy. Okay. She kept appearing in their mind's eye, arching her back and sighing as he pawed her exemplary breasts, blonde waves crashing over her naked shoulders. And this was Septic Berry, who cut his own hair and only ever wore budget jeans from camping shops and promotional sweaters from manufacturers and distributors of sewage disposal supplies. Miyuki, who liked to think that she was immune to blondes, fell victim to her as well. Is she gay? What the fuck is happening? Jesus or Christ, she said, on walking into the pub and seeing this half-girl, half-Roman candle for the first time. Jesus Christ, smiled the girl, what can I get you? A flustered Miyuki just about managed to get the word snowball out. There was no please, no thank you, just Snowball. It was a drink in which she had never had any interest. As the evening crept on, Miyuki recovered her manners and maybe even overcompensated for her earlier lapse, but she couldn't do anything except sit there nursing glasses of the sticky custard-flavored drink and pretending to read her book while casting furtive, glances at the girl behind the bar, at her faultless skin and the shape of her breast. This shit is gay as hell. Whatever. This is weird to read to you. Whatever. At her faultless skin and the shape of her breast, and at the way she wrinkled her nose when she smiled, and at her back view as she strolled around collecting glasses and emptying ashtrays. She could hardly sleep for thinking about her, and the next day it took all the strength she had to stop herself from going to the shop to see if they had any bottles of Blue Stratus. As she got ready to go to the pub, she rummaged through her suitcase and looked at the clothes she had brought with her. They all seemed so shabby. When she got there, having carefully rehearsed her order for a pint of bitter, the girl had gone. Miyuki sat silently, burning with shame. She was supposed to be in love already, not having violent crushes on teenage barmaids. She knew that she would have never done anything about it, even if she had been able to, but she still felt wretched. Convinced the stuffed pike was giving her disapproving looks, and knowing he was in the right, she drank far too many pints of Rains that night. None of Septic Berry's winter girlfriends had anticipated the dusting in the pub, the stock rotation, the interminable conversations with lunchtime drinkers, or the smell of metal polish that was so hard to scrub from their fingers. As the December winds rattled the caravan at night and crept in through the gaps in the windows and doors, they all concluded that whatever it was that they had been running away from wasn't as bad as all that. Their New Year's resolution would invariably be to leave, to clear out on the first day of January itself, or not long afterwards. When the blonde girl had gone, leaving a note in the caravan, "Oh, Septic Berry, I'm so sorry." Everybody breathed a sigh of relief because at least things could begin to go back to normal. That's crazy. Although on balance he had wished she was still around, even Septic Berry felt a weight lifted from his shoulders. He had never quite been able to relax enough to truly enjoy the time he spent with her. A few weeks after her departure, the scent of gentleman's cologne had insinuated itself into the carpet, and the wallpaper began to subside. And Septic Berry's ex faded with it into the past. Everybody assumed she had left to become a pop star, a toothpaste model, or an actress. For months afterwards, every time they turned on the television, they half expected to see her smiling out at them. It never crossed their mind that she might have gone back to live with her mom and dad in Quimbran, found a job in a shop, and got back together with her ex-boyfriend, who forgave her the moment she asked him to, even after everything he had said. This January, though, Septic Berry's girlfriend was still around over a week into the month. She smiled at him as she pulled his beer. She patted his hand across the bar in quiet moments, and when they left to go back to the caravan at closing time, she took his arm. She was friendly and normal and nice-looking. Without being so nice-looking, it was weird. And although nobody liked to ask, it was clear that she was a more suitable age than his usual visitors. None of them could quite work out what somebody who seemed so well-balanced was doing with Septic Berry. But then none of them would ever quite work out what anybody was doing with Septic Berry. It was always seemed to make perfect sense when they left, but that just didn't seem to be happening this year. Miyuki read the final page of her scruffy paperback, closed it, and put it on the table. She made sure she read a book every day for the 2 weeks of her stay. She loaded her bag with slim to medium-sized volumes, and by the time she got home, she would have the satisfaction of knowing she had read an average of more than 1 book a month for the whole year. Before it was even February, she sat quietly with her pint and her salt and vinegar-flavored peanuts without thinking of a great deal. During her stays in the village, most days would pass with her hardly saying a thing. One night, as she lay in bed waiting to fall asleep, she realized that all she had said for that entire day was please when Mr. Edwards pointed at the brains pump and thanks when he handed over her change. She had drunk 4 pints that night, so that totaled 8 words. Normally, she would be a bit more talkative as she thanked strangers for holding open shop doors, greeted passing walkers with a word about the weather, or simply drank more beer. But even though the 8-word day was exceptional, the count rarely exceeded a few dozen. Calls home weren't allowed, and she was content to sit quietly and mind her own business. She wasn't interested in getting involved in the lives of the people around her. They were just part of the scenery. It was only when Septic Berry sat beside her that she had anything that came close to being a proper conversation. Over at the bar, it was Mr. Pugh's round, more of the same, thunder thighs, he said, and Septic Berry's girlfriend pulled 3 pints of brains. Mr. Pugh called all women thunder thighs. Miyuki had perfectly presentable thighs, as did Septic Berry's girlfriend. If anything, all 4 of their thighs were above average in quality. What the fuck? Once they realized that there was nothing personal in what he said, that he was under the impression that it was a charmingly playful term of endearment. They became used to it and didn't really notice when it happened. Every once in a while, though, Mr. Pugh would meet a woman who didn't have the slimmest thighs. Having been greeted by him in his customary way, she wouldn't be able to stop thinking about it, and would sleep badly that night, and not feel any better in the morning. Miyuki dabbed her right forefinger around the peanut packet, collecting the leftover flakes of salt and monosodium glutamate, and pressing them onto her tongue. What the hell? She half listened for a while to some advice about the best way of responding to an alligator attack, then nodded her goodbye to tall Mr. Hughes, short Mr. Hughes, and Mr. Pugh as they drained their glasses, put on their coats and caps, and headed home. She stuffed the empty peanut packet into her glass which she took back to the bar. She had meant to follow the others out into the night, but she reminded herself that she was on holiday, so instead she ordered another pint. As she took her change, she asked Mr. Edwards if he had a Yellow Pages she could look at. He rummaged around beneath the counter for a while, and eventually resurfaced clutching a splayed copy that was covered in smears of spilled beer and cola syrup. It looked as though it had been down there for decades. She was surprised to see it was the current edition. Thanking him, she took it over to her table and turned to the P section. Miyuki had rented the same single-story, 1-bedroomed terraced cottage for as long as she'd been going to the village, but she still hadn't quite got the hang of its temperamental lock. The brains was only 3.7%, but it all added up, and after her extra pint, she fumbled in the dark for a full minute before getting back inside. She put a log on the fire and then sat watching the flames through the glass. Her contact lenses were starting to itch. She didn't really enjoy touching her eyeballs, and back at home, she could rarely be bothered with contact lenses. Usually she wore a pair of National Health glasses, which she sponged down with white spirit at the end of the day before running them under the tap, drying them on her sleeve, and putting them straight back on her face. But on these trips, glasses were an annoyance. They were simply threatening to blow away in the wind, and even on relatively still days, the sea could be magnificently rough, thundering into the rocks, and up in grand white plumes as it tends to in oil paintings. Even if the salty spray was so fine she could neither see nor feel it, it would keep misting up the lenses. She pinched the little bits of plastic out of her eyes, dropped them onto the top of the stove as watched as they hissed and danced the tango, then curled and uncurled like maggots before giving up and lying still. She sat down in the armchair, and as she watched the flames, her eyelids began to fall. Some time later, she woke up. She shuffled to the sink, where she drank a pint of water and refilled the glass for her bedside. She set her alarm to make sure she would be on time for her planned expedition, then quickly changed into her nightclothes, switched off the light, and flopped belly down onto the double bed, where she spread out like the cross of St. Andrew, because she could. End of chapter 2. I love you so much, Rose. Good night.